Hello, and welcome to another very special episode of the Storied Arcs podcast. I am your co-host, Mike, and today we are bringing you another creator interview with Pornsak Pichetshote. Today, we're going to hear all about his work as an editor at Vertigo, which includes some titles like The Unwritten, ever heard of it? We've done a deep dive on that. Another one he handled was Day Tripper, which is one that once we have the guts, we will cover that on this podcast. And he, of course, is the writer of The Good Asian. And without any further ado, we're going to jump straight into that interview. Follow him on Twitter, if that still exists when this comes out, on Instagram, and be sure to pull anything with his name on it. Get the deluxe edition of The Good Asian, and keep an eye out for him this fall.
I guess what I want to start is, how did you get into comics, both as a personal interest and then as a profession? Because we know when you look back at your CV, it has this long line of books you edited, especially at Vertigo, before you get into writing. So how did you get into it, comics growing up with it or as a reader? And then how did you get into the industry?
Yeah, so I think getting into comics, I probably got into comics the same way everyone of a certain generation gets into comics. Like, you find them at convenience stores, you find them at like supermarkets and all that sort of stuff. And it's that cheap entertainment that you can continually pour back to when you're a kid, right? Like, my parents were parents that were like, monitored it wasn't called that at the time, but monitored my screen time. They didn't want me watching too much television. So as a result, you can go back to your room and just read your comics over and over and over again. But I think for me too, like, part of that was when I was 12, my parents decided like, hey, we're going to move the family to like Thailand for like a year. And so we went back for a year. And then 1 year became 2 years and then 3 years. And then me and my sisters were like, oh, no, we just live in Thailand now. Like, they just straight up moved us and did not want an argument. And I think part of that was like me trying to figure out like the person I would be if I stayed in America. So I would hold on to all these like lifelines of like American pop culture. And again, comics was the easiest one. It's something I could read over and over again. I would get one, I would pore over them for a while. So like I was, someone mentioned before, like I was kind of obsessed with comic book editing before I knew what editing was, because I would know all the names in the credits box. I'd be more familiar with that than maybe like what happens in the issue, just because, it was just a way of pouring over. So I think that's where my comics obsession like really sort of tipped over and me getting to know all these aspects of comics. But oddly enough, like comics, when I was starting out, comics was still this thing I just wanted to do for fun. Like I was kind of going more of a film sort of prose writing background. And I wanted to keep, like, the only hobby I had left was going to the comic book store like every Wednesday, and I kind of didn't want to mess that up. But then a friend of mine heard that Karen Berger over at Vertigo was looking for an assistant editor. And he kind of emailed me and was just like, I don't know what any of those words mean, but it feels like you would. So it feels like you should do this. And I was like, yeah, no. And I kind of I wasn't looking for a full-time job. I kind of wanted to do that freelancer thing of just like, let's go without a net and see what that leads to. And, I phrased that as if it was a choice. But it was a choice that like, I wasn't taking like temp gigs or anything like that. I was like, I'm just going to keep to like freelance work and see what happens. And so I wasn't looking for a full-time job, but I was just like, I'd really want to meet Karen Berger. Like, I've been such a fan of Vertigo. I've been such a fan of her work. That was my biggest ambition, was to come out of it saying, oh, I talked to Karen Berger and she was cool. And that interview led to an editing test, which led to another interview, and she led me to getting a job as an assistant editor. And that kind of started my comics career. And then I lost all my hobbies. I have no more hobbies now.
That's all you had left.
It's all I had left. I still have, in all these years later, I still have not picked up a new hobby.
So what year was that now? When was that interview? When did that start?
It's 2003.
2003. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I think about Vertigo in these kind of ways. You had like the initial wave, which were really kind of spun out of your DC titles through the early 90s, really to about 03. And then almost in my mind, I guess right when you start there, we started getting books like something like Fables and that starts like the second wave of Vertigo, which is the stuff that when I was getting back into comics, like that was, exactly the stuff I was diving into.
Yeah.
And so I have a real reverence for those books there. But to jump in at a time like that is pretty bad. I think again when you look back through the books that your name is next to, I mean I know there's some of Mike and mine's favorite books. I mean,
Thanks.
So when I have an understanding a little bit of what an editor does, like in the big two books. Like if you're the Batman editor or the Spider-Man editor, you're looking across multiple lines. You're dealing with multiple different creative teams and things like that. When it comes to a creator-owned book or something like Vertigo, where we'll throw a book out that Mike and I covered on the show, The Unwritten, one of the books that we love here. Like, what is your job kind of entail in terms of being the editor on that book? Like, what are the things that you're juggling and what tasks are you in charge of?
The thing I kind of love about editing is that no book is the same. And as an editor, you shouldn't approach, if you're working on creator-owned books, you shouldn't approach every book the same way. So every book has a different role that you're sort of filling. Sometimes you're just being the traffic cop. Sometimes you're talking over stories with the writers. For something like The Unwritten was really interesting in that Mike and Peter had done this like classic run of Lucifer.
Yeah.
But they hadn't done a project since then, and they had pitched stuff and none of it quite got over the finish line. And so what I kind of came on board was just like, how can we find something that is so classically Mike and Peter, but that, I thought I could convince people would have commercial sort of potential, because that was a problem with the previous ones. They just didn't feel like they would sell. And so that was me, and working with Mike and Peter, we really got to be a team in terms of that, and it was always about, the way I look at editing in general is the easiest way to describe an editor. I've said this once, is like, it's just a friend. It's, and a good friend will tell you what you want to hear when you want to hear it. A great friend will tell you what you need to hear, what you don't want to hear when you need to hear it. And that's a little bit of what an editor does. As an editor, you're constantly trying to protect the book, and protecting the book. The first step of that is everyone getting on the same page as what the book is. Once you all know what the book is, then all of you, and I feel this way as a writer as well, all of you are in service to whatever you guys have agreed the story is. And then it's about communication, of just being like, a lot of times my notes to writers would be like, listen, this is really good. When we talked about this script, you said you wanted it to do this. Do you still want it to do that? Because I don't think this is hitting it. That said, it's really good. You tell me what your intent is for this. And 9 times out of 10, they'll say, oh, no, I still want to do that thing that we talked about. And they're like, oh, okay, great. Well, then if that's the case, these are the things that would help me get it to that place that we had the original conversation. And a lot of times, some writers will do small tweaks of pages, but I've had writers like do full-scale rewrites, just to like page 1 rewrites, because they want to hit that thing that they originally talked about. So that's a little bit on the writing side. That's a little bit on the development side. In the development side, you're doing a little bit more of, you're an advocate for certain things. Like when I was editing The Unwritten, I was like, Mike and Peter are the 2 best problem solvers in comics. So I can't help on that front. But they were having trouble getting a pitch over the door, across the finish line, which meant that it wasn't commercial enough. So then my job was to be like, well, and eventually that's how we circled around to The Unwritten. It was a pitch of just like, there's a little bit of Harry Potter, but there's also a lot of Da Vinci Code in there. And there's like the 2 literary behemoths, but it's about literature. It's about stories. And so it was a way that we all looked at it. It's just like, I can easily see the audience for this kind of book. And not only that, I can see the audience that buys Vertigo books for these kind of books.
Sure.
So that was like a little bit of like what I brought to the table for those particular 2. But for every team, it's different. And as an editor, you're weighing in on everything. And again, I use it. The metric, the measure, the bar I use is like, you're being a friend. So you're being a friend to an artist, and you're saying like, hey, I know what you can do. You're not hitting that here. Do you want to hit that there? Is that your interest? And if so, I have some suggestions. I'm not an artist myself, so if I'm wrong, feel free. I'm just trying to help you get to that thing that you said you wanted to do. And then when it comes to the colorist and letterer, then I'm just kind of like, okay, well, the writer and artist has poured a lot into this. I want to protect them. So I want coloring that's going to make the most out of them, put them in the best light. If it washes over the great work that they're doing, well, that isn't really putting them in the best light. If, if the artist spent like 2 days cross-hatching this background and all of a sudden the color painted on this dark purple so no one can see it, then it's like, well, that guy did all that work for nothing, and it's my job to make sure that something comes out of that. So that's a little bit what I see all the way down the line.
So when you talk about traffic cop, that's kind of what you're saying. Like everything's coming in here, and you're just making sure that I think what like with the idea you said that you kind of talk about it beforehand. So everyone had an agreement beforehand, but then everyone has to go out and do their own jobs. Yeah. And so in your mind, you see it as like, well, we got to break. Are we still doing that thing we talked about? Make sure bring everyone back to the center, and it can. You're saying it can shift sometimes. Maybe you decide that isn't the direction you want to go, but you feel it's your responsibility to say like, hey, when we started this thing, we were all right here. Yeah. And are we all still there? And if so, here's how to get that. Here's how to go in that direction. Make sure we're all pulling in the right
and a lot of,
for
me,
way.
it's not necessarily here's how to get in that direction, but it's like, well, here's what I noticed that took me off that path. Right. So, I'm that extra set of eyes, because, the artist is with this stuff a lot. The writers with this stuff, not as much as the artist, but still a lot. So I'm into this. I am sitting with this stuff with a much smaller amount of time than they are. So I have the freshest eyes in the bunch. So I'm the one that can say, like, okay, I know what you guys are intended. As a fresh eyes, this is where I don't think I got a little lost here. Yeah. I'm not saying my perspective is the end all be all, but if you trust my perspective, then it might be worth addressing these things.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. So I'm just so curious. This is probably the last editing question, but just as a comparison, you said each project's different. Totally makes sense. Mike and Peter, very close, worked together before. Yeah. Can't possibly be as close as Moon and Ba when you go to Day Tripper. Yeah. What was that one like?
So Moon and Ba was really interesting because that one I actually inherited. Bob Schreck deserves all the credit for like bringing them on board and all that. And they know what they're doing, right? They I mean, everyone
they know what they're about.
Knows what they're doing. And but also they didn't live together. They live like down the block from each other. So they're very much in communication. So there I had a different role. There was just like, well, English wasn't their first language. So, when the scripts were coming in, if anything felt like felt forced or didn't feel fluid, it was my turn to sort of pitch my 2 cents in. But where I think I had probably the most contribution, the biggest contribution to that book was very early on. They told me, this is what the book is about. We have no idea how to sell it. That's your job. Good luck. And I'm just like, okay. And for anyone who hasn't read Day Tripper, if you have read Day Tripper, I'm not going to spoil it for people who haven't. There's a big twist at the end of the first issue. Yeah. That big twist is what they pitched to get the book greenlit. They can't talk about that big pitch in any of the promotion of the book. So they were like, we have no idea how to sell this. Yeah. And no one had any idea how to sell this when the book had gotten to me. So, the good news was they're not slow, but they're not fast. And so a lot of the book had to be done before we solicited. So I had months to just keep it in the back of my head about like, how do we talk about this book? And that's when I was sort of looking, and this wasn't in the language of the pitch, but I realized it was very much in the spirit of the book, where it's just like, oh, if you look at their approach, what they're kind of saying is, these are the most important days in the life of this character. And so so it's like, okay. And if you look at that, there's a way of looking at that first issue. It's like, is that the most important day of the life of the character? But at the same time, by the time you get to the end of the series, you kind of realize that, oh, wait, maybe in a weird way it is. Yeah. And maybe that's what the book is about. And so that's where I kind of came up with this idea of just like, I think the ad campaign for that was our big tagline is, what are the most important days of your life? Yes. And then Day Tripper was about like, this is a 10-issue story talking about the 10 most important days in this person's life. And that was a way we could get to the spirit of what Fabio and Gabriel were doing every issue without blowing the twist. But at the same time, it was something readers could like grab a hold of and be like, okay, I know what this book is about. Whereas before then, everyone's like, it's a book about life. I'm like, we can't sell that. Yeah.
Right. Well, that's a stroke of genius, because when I want to sell it to someone, I just shove it in their hands and then stare at them as they read it. So I'm glad you have a little more tact than I do.
Yeah. My approach is very similar, which is basically just saying, this is like one of the 5 best books I've ever written, and I'm going to keep talking about it until you read it.
Yeah.
So because when you're done reading it, you're going to want to talk to someone about it, and I'm right here. So I'm gonna keep badgering you. But no, I remember that, seeing that stuff there about, you know, the idea that going into it thinking, okay, so it's like each issue, different point of his life, and wondering as a reader, being like, well, is it going to go chronologically and things like that? Oh, blah, blah. And then reading the first issue and being like, oh, this isn't what I thought it is. But like now I'm completely hooked. Like now I'm in now. But that, so kind of having that kind of ad campaign, that kind of working those solicitations, another part of your job as an editor, doing that kind of job there. That's really cool.
I mean,
that's really cool.
I mean, part of the editing, I mean, you know, in comics, we don't have we do have a marketing department. We don't have the luxury of a dedicated marketing department for each book. Yeah. So a lot of that comes with the editor, and the editor and a lot of it comes from the writer, you know, from the first place. And so you're talking about together as you're developing the book. You're not developing, you know, just what is a good book, but like, okay, how can we make a book that also has a bite-sized version where you can talk about it in a line or two and sort of communicate
that elevator pitch idea, kind of, right? You know, kind of how do you sell the book there? Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
All right. So finally moving on to your work as a writer. We got a few questions about The Good Asian specifically, but I'm going to start with this because in our discussion, which we've partially recorded, I likened it to The West Wing, which I hope is a favorable comparison for you.
Yes, it's one of my biggest influences. Oh my God, I'm honored.
Okay, well, I also see, not to be too creepy, but I do see Story by Robert McKee on your shelf, which is one of my favorite books, despite having never written anything. But the West Wing comparison came from, you know, I'm a white, young-ish guy from the other side of the country. Yeah, I have the least hair on the podcast, but like, I would have not known there was anything significant happening in immigration, specifically in 1936, apart from kind of, you know, the lessons you learn in the book. But the book isn't didactic in that way. It's a character book. The story, you know, the mystery is this complex thing on its own, yet you're able to inform the reader of a historical, political, social issue at the same time. And so I'm wondering, you know, what are your influences there? I haven't really read many other comics that do that. I think either they get a little heavy-handed and preachy, or they are just kind of fun character studies, or, you know, whatever. But you've been able to weave them together in The Good Asian.
Well, okay. So first of all, thank you for the West Wing comparison, because the West Wing is an enormous influence on me, and no one's ever brought it up with me before. So I
would say you even speak in a Sorkinian speed.
I appreciate that. What's funny is I redid my library recently because I was running out of space for books, and normally the West Wing like script books are like right here.
Oh, yeah, mine are just out of frame.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So you totally would have saw those as well, like in the same shelf as the Story in the Key book. No, the West Wing is an enormous influence, and one of the things that the West Wing specifically taught me watching it, and I watched every episode, then I watched them again with audio commentary, then I bought the script books, and then I rewatched the episode and compared it with the script. Like, I was obsessed over that show. I am a huge Sorkin nut. And one of the things that the West Wing sort of taught me was that what he did there was he told personal stories in a political environment. And by telling personal story, when you tell a personal story, if Sam's going through something with his dad because his dad is cheating, it's going to have a reflection on something that's happening in the political sphere. And so that was a show that kind of taught me, if Meg Carey has this thing about pitching your tent, that if you pitch your tent in the right soil, 90% of the work is done for you. And it was kind of the same for political stuff. It's just that if you pitch your tent in political story, you don't have to you don't have to editorialize it for them to have political ramifications. Everything that you do, everything the character does is going to have a political ramification. Everything the characters in the West Wing does has a you can see it through a political lens because they are in the center and the hub of politics. And the West Wing was really influential for me to help me see that. You know, The Wire is another show that kind of works the same way. And that to me cracked the code of just like, me as a writer doesn't have to go in and make a political allegory with my characters, because that does become didactic. all I have to do is pitch soil, find situations that are very politically charged, and then you get to tell character stories, and the politics come sort of from that, because that's how politics stem from. They're about from people just doing things, and their reactions in this sphere of power lead to political consequences. So that was kind of but the West Wing was an enormous influence on me, of being able to help me see that. And, I've worked on other books. My training at Vertigo and my time at Vertigo taught me a lot. I worked with Josh Dysart on Unknown Soldier, which was also a very political book that met action with politics. Andy Diggle's work on The Losers.
No, definitely, yeah.
Peter Milligan and what he was doing with Human Target, and Peter Milligan, what he was doing in Shade the Changing Man, which I didn't work on, but I could look at that as a fan. Garth found ways to do it in his work. Garth Ennis found ways to do it in their, Warren Ellis found ways to do it in his work. Grant Morrison found ways to so a lot of and Alan Moore found ways to do it, and they all found their own approaches to it. It was very much sort of in that sort of Vertigo DNA, and I had this luxury of being able to look at all the different writers and see sort of their approaches to it, and saw what worked, what felt heavy-handed, and what didn't. But honestly, most of the time, it really comes down to and to me, it was taking all that, and I think the West Wing was kind of my North Star of just like, if you find conflict that is political and throw your characters in them, you can just have your characters be characters, and the stories will be political. And actually, the work comes on the opposite end. Then the work actually becomes, well, let me make sure that my characters aren't saying something I don't agree with. Let me make sure, we're not taking these things down the line of just like, I'm advocating something that as a person I don't advocate at all. But then there is, at that point, you come into this thing of, all right, but if I get down to that route, why do we get down to that route? Why did it make sense on a story or a character level, but not make sense on what I, Pornsak, personally believe? Mm-hmm. And then you have that little conversation with yourself, and hopefully sometimes it teaches you some stuff about yourself that you didn't know. And I've had projects in the past where I have a project that I killed because I didn't feel comfortable with what it was saying politically, only to find out 2 or 3 years later that was exactly what was happening in the political world at the time. And I was just like, there is something to be said about going towards the truth and working through that uncomfortable stuff, as opposed to saying, I don't want to say this because, the world might end up saying that.
Sure. Yeah, that's interesting. So it sounds like you were being like, you were allowing yourself to write and be kind of naive about it. And then when you kind of went back to edit it, you were like, ooh, I'm kind of reading it as this, and it's kind of second guessing. Whereas what I'm hearing is you just kind of trust the story you're telling and the trajectory your characters are on. And I mean, if you're not writing it as a political hack piece, it's not going to be, a political hack piece.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a lot of times too, like you figure a lot of that stuff out in the plotting on sort of the macro stage. And sometimes what I found I've done is that, and I think at the time it says like, oh, if it's a story like this, it's got to end like this. And so, and then I'll worry at the time of like, oh, is that too obvious? And one of the things I find is that once you're on the page, you're constantly trying to beat yourself, and that obvious ending morphs and shifts to something that isn't obvious, but very right by the themes of your book.
That's actually kind of where I wanted to go next here was aside from the political commentary in the book, which I do want to get back to, but focusing solely on the mystery aspect, the actual plotting of the story, the fact that we have a guy coming in, he's a detective, and he's trying to figure out a missing person case, and the story goes out from there.
Yeah,
and it has all the trappings of your kind of classical neo-noir, hard-boiled detective story. When you're writing something like that, do you think about the ending and work your way backwards to think about what these twists are, or do you start with that inciting event and start thinking about the characters and then work your way into what your various twists and turns are at various issue breaks and all that?
It's funny. It's something that happens so organically. Like I have a hard time distinctly remembering, and so much so that whenever I start a new book, I'm kind of like, how did I do this again? And but a lot of times I have moments that I know I want, big moments, my sort of big swings, but also I do kind of know what sort of the end. I have a version of knowing what the end is, and for the good, again, not to spoil stuff, there is stuff that changed in the course of writing it. There are motivations that got streamlined. There were surprises I made to that were made along the way that I did not find coming. But at the end of the day, I had a baseline of just kind of like, okay, this happens, this happens, this happens. It all hangs together as a mystery. So at the end of the day, I could rest assured to be like, okay, this all I also have like this insane spreadsheet where it's like every ball I throw in the air, I keep track of when I catch it. So I know that
Yeah.
I hopefully I didn't miss anything.
Didn't leave any loose ends out there. Yeah.
Yeah, that was intense anyway.
Mhm.
So
Frankly,
I
it seems like
all,
that's what fans do nowadays too. Like
yeah,
fans will really dissect and pick apart every single thing and make sure, every loose end is tied up. And like
well,
sometimes authors leave those untied on purpose.
yeah.
Um,
And
and
I want to say there are a couple I purposely left untied, which I'm hoping it means I left the right ones untied because no one's yelled at me about them online. But there was some stuff that says, oh, I thought we'd get more into this. Like, oh no, I'm just going to give you a nod. But do you really need more? Maybe you don't. But you're absolutely right. I can't remember who it was, and also like with the advent of social media, you're now very aware when fans do this. Like,
yes,
sure.
Someone online tweeted about how like I'm going to reread The Good Asian again, and I have a notebook to keep track of things. And I'm like, oh my god, that's terrifying.
Not certain it's going to hold up that kind of scrutiny, right?
Yeah.
No.
Like, oh Jesus.
If they have really good input, you just hire them as your editor next time.
Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, you're right. Like fans do sort of go through all that, and I guess too the advent of social media is like you just don't want someone embarrassing you. So online for work you didn't do. So I try to like make sure I have it all done.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of those internet trolls, if you just ignore them, you'll probably be fine. If you engage them, you risk like the Streisand effect.
Yes.
Did you have another one on Good Asian, or were you ready to?
Well, it actually flows between The Good Asian, I think, and Dead Boy Detectives, which I thoroughly enjoyed. The Sandman and Sandman related properties are. Sandman is my favorite comic of all time. It's the reason I read comics now, which is why I have this tie to Vertigo. So it's always great whenever. Like Charles and Edwin come back and you see like Thessaly, these other kind of, I mean, in terms of like Sandman characters, obviously everyone knows Lucifer's is the big spinoff, but these other characters are like, second, third, fourth, like they're not even the endless, but I love seeing them. And what I wanted to get into here is obviously that book has a lot of themes, very specific themes. The mystery they're looking for is the disappearance of a Thai American girl, which is very clear, nod and look at your own heritage and your own history, and so much of that culture and South Asian culture and folklore infuses that book. I have to assume that was hugely important and personal for you to get that in there and to represent where you're from and your culture in the way that we deal with some of these ideas of life and death and things of that nature in trying to portray that to an audience that for largely would be unaccustomed to seeing that.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that was that working on that book was such a joy. For everyone on that book, it was interesting because I always say that I make comics to work with old friends and to make new ones. But Dead Boy Detectives was the first book I worked on where everybody on that book I never met before. And it was such a joy. I loved working with every single person all down the line, from Jeff Stokely, Miguel Muerto, Hassan, Andrea, who edited the book. Alex Ekman Law, and me, like everyone who worked on the book, I just love working with them so much. And for that book, it was an interesting thing where I was having dinner with Chris Conroy because I've known him for a while and we just wanted to catch up. And he mentioned he wanted to sort of expand the Sandman line. And as a former Vertigo editor, sort of, did I have any ideas? And what was funny for me was that like I realized that my first instinct when I talk to another editor is as an editor. So my first instinct was to pitch 2 ideas where they could have got some of my friends to write. And then my last one was just kind of like, or you could do Dead Boy Detectives that had them meet Thai ghosts, and they're really way more up than American ghosts. And he's like, that I want you to do that. Stop. I want to do that, and also stop pitching your friends for work. But yeah, and then that became this great opportunity for me of just kind of like, that is such a luxury and a joy when an editor and a publisher says, hey, I want you to do something that maybe, like, I don't know if I would have done that as a creator-owned book. Not because I couldn't, but just because I wasn't sure if the audience was there, for it. Because, there's such a small enclave of Thai people in America. So So to have a publisher coming along, it's like, no, we want you to lean on the mythology of Sandman and also talk about this aspect of your life and aspect of your culture. That was an enormous gift for me that I really enjoyed. And then from there, it was a chance of like, okay, how can I get a little bit more specific than the stuff I was exploring in The Good Asian? Whereas it could, East Asians are very common in America. Southeast Asians and Thai Americans are such a tiny sliver. So that was a way for me to sort of say, all right, how do I get into what that's like, which is actually very different from just being from the bigger monolith of being Asian.
I mean, I'm sure Chris Conroy will have trust in you from your friendship and your work you've done there. But do you think the success of The Good Asian, the fact that it had been out there and people had seen it and it had been recognized, softened the ground, I guess, maybe not on DC's end, but the idea on the reader's end, that the idea of that,
I think so.
They'd be accepting.
I hope so. I think so. It's hard to say because I do think there are people who came to Dead Boy Detectives that were fans of The Good Asian. But I would also say too, and this is all the credit in the world to Chris Conroy. Chris Conroy knew The Good Asian was going to win an Eisner, certainly before I did. He had pegged it very early on. And so much so that, when I won my Eisner, I won the Eisner for Best Limited Series. Yeah. James Tynion won the Eisner for Best Ongoing Series. And Chris was just like, oh, I coincidentally have James writing the Sandman Ongoing and Pornsak writing the Sandman Mini. Yeah. So I will take no notes from anybody. I got this right. But Chris, because Chris is very, very good at what he does, he was able to see that, he was able to see that more so than everybody else and kind of use all that as leverage, I think, to help me in the company, to help get the book pushed in the company. And I hope, it's always hard to say of like, when you write X, are you bringing your audience over to Y? Like it's always hard to say to what degree you can do that. I hope that's the case. It feels like we definitely, there were definitely some Sandman fans who discovered my stuff for the firi'st time. I've definitely heard of people who had never read a Sandman book, and this was their first Sandman book in the Sandman universe. So hopefully there was enough of that out there.
Maybe go in both directions there. Sure. One last Good Asian question. I have to ask about the title. Yeah. Was it always called The Good Asian? Was there any other titles? Because that I think it's in the intro to, I think, the second trade. There's that essay by Dave Choate. He talks about that phrase, and to anyone like myself, or I'm sure yourself, Pornsak, that phrase, to use modern day parlance, that phrase is triggering, and it can be triggering to people like us. The idea of the good Asian or the model minority or something like that. And I remember seeing that in the solicitation and not knowing your work yet, because I hadn't read Infidel yet, and I came to the book because of Alec DeFinke's art on Apo Zero. But reading the solicitation, looking at it, and for me having to be like, okay, it's a detective story. I like that. That seems kind of cool. I like the art. I'm going to trust that they know what they're doing with this title. And obviously to get into the book and to feel, I get what they're going for here. But was that always the title, knowing that what that phrase means and kind of the weight that it carries or can carry?
It's funny. I had a conversation about this recently with a friend. I don't think there was ever another title I was considering, but that said, for me, the title's always the last part of the process. I need to really kind of know what the story is about before I sort of land on the title. So as a result, for me, all my temp titles feel like titles. Like all my titles feel like temp titles. They were just like, we ran out of time. But The Good Asian was the one that was always there. And partly because, and I think what a lot of it is when I'm coming up with a title, it starts with me looking for sort of a thematic North Star in terms of like what the book is about. And then from there, I feel like, is it actually a cool title? Does this kind of work? And I knew the book was about the good Asian. It was about, the model minority myth. It was about, just everything that kind of comes with that and also too, the realization of, just putting an Asian protagonist at the center of anything, you suddenly find yourself thrust with those questions. What does it do? What does it do for the community? Is this a good representation or a bad representation? So all of that was kind of baked in there. And so I knew something like The Good Asian was kind of thematically, where I was going. And then it felt like the title. And I think what cemented it in my head was my friend Josh Dysart sort of when he heard like my title is like, oh right, like the good German, that Soderbergh noir. And I'm like, oh okay, so now it's kind of like, now it kind of felt like within the universe of noir titles that I'm like, okay, this is the right title. Like this isn't just me thematically, this is now a noir title.
It's beyond just your subject matter, but it's everything about the book. That's interesting. That it works out that way. Like that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think every book I do, I find myself wondering, it's like, oh, was that the best title? Could I tried harder? Could I have worked harder? I don't think a book comes out where I don't second guess the title of the book.
Yeah. Well, I do think this one absolutely works. You're right. I mean, it is that theme that, I mean, it's brought up throughout the book throughout, whether it's Edison saying it or someone saying it to him, the idea of, we have to be undeniable. I think that's one of the lines that's in there, that if we just show them that they can't get rid of us, that we're essential, then that'll be enough. And there are people that believe that, and there are people that still believe that, and kind of maybe regardless of what history shows, but that idea persists, I think, really very strongly, I think, in our communities, in the Asian communities, the idea of you put your head down, you go to work, don't cause any trouble, go and succeed, and that's how you'll thrive. But like I said, that phrase can be triggering to some people because it is not always the way that it actually is, but it's what's ingrained in our communities here in the States.
Yeah. I mean, it is absolutely a loaded term, and I definitely went into it knowing it was a loaded term. But I also feel like, and I go back and forth about I go back and forth about it, and I should say I went back and forth for a while, but I'm in a decent place with it now, primarily because one of the things I've found is that, and this was a really fascinating thing when I launched it, Asian people know exactly what I'm talking about when they see that title.
Yeah. Right.
I find it's non-Asian people that are the first ones that say, is this offensive? Should I be offended? I think I might be offended about this. And what I found that happens, that leads to a discussion. And then if they do it on social media anyway, someone Asian pops on the line and it's just like, well, no, this is what we do. And then that person's like, either like, oh yeah, I get it now, or I had no idea that was a thing. And it leads to sort of that discussion. And so one of the things I found, I don't think it was a clearest sense very early on that with that title, I realized like, oh, I'm actually talking directly to Asians with the use of the title because Asians know what that phrase means. Whereas I think non-Asians are worried if this is offensive or not and need to be talked through. Like, yes, maybe they should, but there's a big conversation. And if you're offended by just the word, imagine living with that as an idea through your life.
Yeah. Which I as you're saying this, I think this is a discussion that Alex and I had. I can't remember if it was before we were recording or right as we started recording, where I was talking about when I approached the book on the shelf as the white guy, I was like, ooh, like, is this an okay term? Is this for me? Whatever. But like at the end of the day, first of all, I've just got like a couple covers here. Like at the end of the day, as a comic guy, like, yeah, those are for me. But and then as you're talking about this, I was like, I really wish I should have gone and edited that part out of the discussion if I did. And then I'm like, no, because Alex immediately intuitively picked up, what the title meant, what it's for, and explained it to me. Not in a condescending way. It's like, oh yeah, I learned something, and hopefully, other people don't have to put their ignorance on the internet like I did. But they can just they can learn from. But yeah. So again, to me, that's kind of the Sorkinian thing here. Is like, it didn't seem like you definitely. I never heard you say like, I sat down to teach white people about Asian culture,
right?
But I did learn it. I mean, I did a piece of it, and I'm very grateful for, the cultural exposure, the historical exposure, all of those things that I picked up throughout the book, in addition to, a great mystery and a great comic book.
I appreciate it. And I would also say too, like, a lot of that book is me teaching myself about Asian culture. Like, I think one of the theses of that book is, and one of the reasons why the book is a period piece is that, like, as Asians, we don't talk about our history as Asian Americans, and that history is so pertinent to sort of where we are now. Like, the idea that the model minority myth was something created to protect us against white violence is, something really important in how we forge whatever Asian American themes and Asian identity going forward is acknowledging that. But I think as a culture, we've kind of forgotten that. And we certainly forgot that before, the anti-Asian violence in 2021, where people started talking about it again.
Well, I think one thing that it brought up to me in Mike and I's discussion is how specific the years are. Obviously the collection that's coming out is going to be The Good Asian: 1936, and and it's very specific in terms of you talk about it's like a generation removed from the Chinese Exclusion Act, and so what are the results of that of not like the couple years after, but we're talking like 50 some odd years after. What's the end result? What do we get to? And I think about those years, and then I think like, oh, so like in less than 30 years, my family's going to be in the States coming over from Korea, And so what happens in between that time? Well, there's still a lot of immigration restriction there, but the end of, you have the end of World War II, the collapse of the Imperial Japan and all that. But still, like, so this book takes place one generation from the most targeted immigration ban there is, and then the story of my life technically starts half generation after this book takes place, and start doing the math in my head, and it's like that wasn't that long ago. Like we're not talking long. People I know, my family was alive during parts of this. Even if they weren't here, and it makes history. It becomes so stark in my mind as I was reading again, just like, this isn't what we talk about, and like, what would it have been like? I don't really know, what that process would have been like in the 30s, 40s, 50s, even in the 60s, in terms of immigrating here, knowing what the kind of the tale was for how immigration was viewed specifically from Asia.
Yeah. And I think that's a lot of it is like, we have a tendency to think American history is longer than it actually is. It's like that classic thing that people talk about, how like there was color film around when Martin Luther King was alive, but we use pictures in black and white because we want to believe it was that much longer than it was. It was one of the reasons too, I wanted to do something about the Chinese Exclusion Act, but if I was to do it right when it started, then it looked like a Western. And I didn't want people to think that it was something that was, it like you say, it's something that lasted for a very long time. And so a noir kept everything contemporary. It still felt period, but still contemporary. It's like, oh, wait, the cars are different, but like everything else is kind of pretty similar to what it looks like now. And this stuff was all still happening.
No, I think you can also, we have an idea of what those noir stories are. And maybe not only, and I think maybe it's not only because they're set in the 1930s and whatnot, but maybe because they were made in the 1950s and 60s. And so we think of them as movies from that era, even though they're set much earlier. So they feel more contemporary than maybe the actual story that takes place. It's the language of our cultural language of those hardboiled detective noir stories that kind of feeds back into our understanding that, that wasn't so long ago. And yet these are some really foreign ideas that I think a lot of people probably had no idea of. What you said about American history not being as long as we think it is obviously so incredibly true. We're just going on, 200 plus some odd years versus other places that are like, that's cute, 200 some odd years,
exactly. Exactly. The buildings aren't that old. Nothing's around for that long.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But we view it in this long arc of history, though. But it's 1.5 generations, if that, maybe 2 at most, to get back to the times that we think of as like the way back. It's not that far.
100%.
Well, we want to honor your time. So just 2 last things. One, what are you currently working on? Anything to promote, plug, things that people should?
Anything you can promote.
List? Yeah.
Well, I realize, anything you can promote. Yeah. Obviously.
Well, obviously for him, the title comes last. So if there's some vague project in a specific genre, we should just be looking for with your name on it in the near future. Anything coming?
So let's see. So right now is the Good Asian 1936 hardcover, which collects the whole book and the whole thing, and with a bunch of extras. And it's
kind of all the variants in there. Does
Has all the variants in there.
Because
It
the
has all the variants in there.
the covers are incredible. Dave Johnson's covers, all the variants by all the artists. So awesome. Love
Not only does it have all the variants in there, it has cover sketches from the variant artists, so you can see like what we could have chosen from, as well as it also includes sort of the first time reproductions of the store exclusives. So you could if you ever had a chance to see those, then there's some of the some beautiful stuff there. And so that's on sale sort of now. That's the thing I'm pushing. To me, that is how I've always wanted the book to be sort of consumed. So it's really great to have that out there. I think sometime in October, November, the trade for Dead Boy Detectives, the Sandman Universe Dead Boy Detectives are coming out, where we have the Dead Boys meet some Thai ghosts, and it's like their whimsy meets up with like some hardcore Asian horror. And all I can say is next year will hopefully be a fun year for me. I got some stuff cooking I'm really excited about. The way my life works is I do everything a year in advance and can't talk about any of it until like 2 months before they drop.
Yeah. And then all the details are a little foggy because you've moved on.
Right.
The thing for next year.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, then final question. Can we expect to see more from either Edison Hark or the Good Asian Universe? This colon 1936 has really hinted that maybe there's other colons to follow.
Yes, there will definitely be more Edison Hark stories. I'm definitely hard to work with that. It will happen not as fast as you want, but maybe hopefully sooner than you think. But yes, the books take me a lot to put together, so it takes a lot of time. And also, I need to work on other stuff just to sort of cleanse my palate, because the world of Edison Hark is a dark world, and I can't live in there all the time.
No doubt about that. Whatever form it comes, because we were talking about, we were speculating wildly at the end of our discussion. We were like, maybe, now he's got the character set up, maybe it's just OGN, it's a kind of reckless style, like Ed Brubaker or Sean Phillips, or maybe it's like whole new arcs and he introduces new characters, and then each character can have its own. Like this could be
we were thinking, well, since it was colon insert year here, like, well, what's the next like semi-important year for Asians in American? Well, I don't know, maybe 1941, 1942, something like that. The Good Asian there's some possibilities. So we were talking about the idea of it coming back in whatever form it is, but I know when it does come out, I know Mike and I'll be reading it, and we definitely can't wait, whether that's in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however long it takes, how many years it is, we'll be there for it. So
I really appreciate that. Appreciate that. And the goal is to give you something that you guys think makes logical sense, but also really surprises you at the same time. Awesome. So yeah,
that's great. Well, you are on both of our pool lists permanently. So
thank you.
Just anything you want to make, we will consume and disseminate. So,
I appreciate that, guys. I really do.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Pornsak. That was awesome.
Thank you.
It's great talking to you.
Yeah, great talking to you guys. See you, man. Bye.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening. And for more info on this episode on Pornsak and his work, be sure to visit storiedarcs.com. We will provide links to his social profile, any links to affiliate shops or anything like that he has. And you can find a deep dive on his work on The Good Asian and anything else that comes up after the episode is released. Storiedarcs.com, and we'll see you next week.